Hollywood's golden age wasn't all glitz and glamour. Beneath the bright lights and iconic smiles lay shadows darker than any script could write. These weren't just stars, they were legends, adored by millions, immortalized on film. But behind the scenes, some lived lives far more chilling than their most dramatic roles. From terrifying public downfalls to secret addictions and emotional unraveling, these 12 old Hollywood actors carried secrets that still haunt the industry today. Some were consumed by fame, others destroyed by silence, and one story is so disturbing, it's almost too hard to believe. This isn't just a look back at legends, it's a descent into the darkest corners of Hollywood history. Barbara Payton had the looks of a goddess and the screen presence of a star, but behind that glamorous surface was a life unraveling into something far darker than even Hollywood dared to admit. She skyrocketed to fame in the early 1950s, co-starring with Gary Cooper and James Cagney. Magazines called her the next Jean Harlow. But Barbara's dark secret wasn't just substance use or bad relationships, it was self-destruction happening in full view while the cameras rolled and the studios turned away. In 1951, her love life exploded into front-page scandal. She was caught between two men, actor Frank Attone and hot-headed tough guy Tom Neal. The fight for her affection turned savage. Neal beat Tone so badly he was hospitalized with a broken cheekbone and a brain concussion. The public was horrified. Studios blacklisted her almost overnight. That was the beginning of the spiral. Within just a few years, Barbara went from red carpets to mugshots. She posed for sleazy photo shoots, hustled cheap roles in Z-list films, and was eventually arrested multiple times. By the 1960s, she was no longer an actress. She was a ghost of herself. Once she was spotted wandering Sunset Boulevard barefoot, dirty, and mumbling to herself, unrecognizable from the siren she once was. She wrote a memoir during this time called I Am Not Ashamed. It wasn't a comeback, it was a cry from the wreckage. She was living in a series of flophouses, often surviving off booze, handouts, and rumors of what she used to be. Barbara Payton didn't just fade away. She was erased, step by step, by the same system that made her. Her story isn't just tragic. It's terrifying, because it proves that in Hollywood, falling from grace isn't a stumble, it's a free fall. And when you hit the bottom, there's no one waiting. Bela Lugosi was Dracula. His stare, his voice, the way he moved, it burned into cinema history. But the real horror wasn't on screen. It was what happened when the cameras stopped rolling. After Dracula made him a star in 1931, Lugosi should have had it all. But Hollywood wanted the monster, not the man. He was typecast, locked into eerie, sinister roles, while other actors moved freely through the studio system. As his career narrowed, his demons grew louder and darker. Behind the curtain, Lugosi battled chronic pain that left him nearly crippled. To cope, he was given strong medication. Relief became dependence. Dependence became a secret life. While the public saw a haunting legend, his friends saw a man wasting away, alone, misunderstood, and quietly unraveling. By the 1940s, he was working for scraps. Low-budget horror films. One-take wonders. Lugosi, once Hollywood royalty, was now reading cue cards because he couldn't memorize lines. His appearance changed. His spark dimmed. But he kept going, even as his addiction followed him to every set. Then came something no one expected. In 1955, Lugosi went public. He checked himself into a hospital and announced that he was battling dependency. It was unheard of at the time. Stars didn't admit weakness, certainly not ones playing immortal creatures of the night. He never truly recovered. His final films were bizarre, almost surreal, fragments of what he once was. And when he died in 1956, he was buried in his Dracula cape. Some called it poetic. Others called it cruel. Bela Lugosi's darkest secret? He became the very thing Hollywood demanded, a monster. And then it left him to rot in the shadows. Errol Flynn was the ultimate Hollywood rogue, handsome, charming, and impossible to ignore. On screen, he was a sword-wielding hero in Captain Blood and the Adventures of Robin Hood. Off-screen, he was chaos in motion. But beneath the debonair grin and the velvet suits was a man surrounded by darkness and scandal. Flynn lived fast. His parties were legendary, filled with champagne, strangers, and excess that blurred into something more sinister. Whispers followed him everywhere. Studio executives cleaned up behind him, silencing accusations, paying off threats, and spinning headlines. But in 1942, the Glamour cracked. He was charged with assault involving 2 underage girls. He denied it. The jury cleared him, but the damage stuck. From then on, the phrase, "in like Flynn," took on a much darker edge. His secret? It wasn't just the headlines, it was the emptiness that fueled them. As he aged, the mask wore thin. His once sculpted face grew tired. He drank relentlessly. Morphine followed later. And while he kept working, his performances became caricatures of his former glory. One director recalled him showing up to set with a drink in one hand and a slur in his speech. Another said Flynn laughed through scenes he once would have dominated. But worst of all, he didn't seem to care. He died at 50, his body so wrecked by alcohol and hard living that the coroner said it resembled that of an old man. And yet, the myth of Flynn, the playboy, the rebel, the star, lives on, scrubbed clean by nostalgia. But behind the velvet curtain and devilish grin was a man spiraling into oblivion, protected by a system that cared more about image than innocence. Judy Garland was the girl who sang "Over the Rainbow." To the world, she was a symbol of innocence, wonder, and magic. But behind the Technicolor dream was a life so controlled, so damaged, it reads more like a horror story than a Hollywood fairy tale. She was just 13 when MGM signed her. Not long after, the pressure began. Executives told her she was too plain, too fat, too emotional. So they gave her pills. Pills to keep her awake. Pills to put her to sleep. Pills to stop her appetite. Studio doctors watched her like handlers. What began as management quickly became dependency. On set, Judy was expected to smile, dance, and deliver perfection, even when she hadn't slept for days. Off set, she was isolated, overwhelmed, and too exhausted to fight the system that built her. She once described herself as a machine, a puppet, and the strings were always pulled by someone else. As she got older, the industry that shaped her turned cold. Her box office appeal began to fade, her personal life unraveled, and the media started hunting her downfall. Marriages collapsed. Comebacks faltered. She fought to reclaim control of her life, but the damage had already been done. There's a moment near the end of her career, on stage in London, eyes hollow, voice shaking, where she sings "The Man That Got Away." It's not just a performance, it's a cry for help. The crowd applauds, but she looks like she's barely standing. Judy Garland's dark secret wasn't just addiction. It was that her entire life was engineered by people who saw her as a product, not a person. And by the time she broke free, there was nothing left to save. Dorothy Dandridge walked into history with grace. She was the first black woman to be nominated for a Best Actress Oscar, a vision of elegance in Carmen Jones, and a symbol of possibility in a segregated industry. But behind the award shows and headlines was a life of quiet devastation, a woman who shattered ceilings only to be left bleeding from the glass. She wasn't just fighting for roles. She was fighting to be seen. Studios adored her beauty, but refused to treat her like a leading lady. She'd perform in lavish clubs where she couldn't walk through the front door. In some venues, she wasn't allowed to use the bathroom. The message was clear: you can entertain, but you don't belong. Her personal life offered no shelter. A failed marriage, betrayal, and the crushing responsibility of caring for a daughter with severe disabilities left her emotionally drained and isolated. The glamour faded, but the pressure didn't. And with fewer roles and fewer allies, she began to unravel. There's a heartbreaking detail from her final years. She would dress up just to walk through hotel lobbies, hoping someone would recognize her, remember her. She was living in a world she once lit up, now as a stranger to it. Dorothy Dandridge didn't just carry the weight of fame, she carried the weight of representation, of being first, and of being denied again and again despite her talent. Her story isn't just tragic, it's unjust. And her silence at the end? That was Hollywood's greatest betrayal. Montgomery Clift didn't just act, he felt. Every expression, every silence, every fractured stare on screen came from someplace real. He was Hollywood's tortured prince, handsome, sensitive, and decades ahead of his time. But behind his soft voice and perfect profile was a life cracking under invisible pressure. Clift lived with secrets he could never speak. In an era when being gay could end a career, he was forced to live in shadows, hiding relationships, burying his truth, constantly looking over his shoulder. The tension between who he was and who the world demanded him to be pulled at him constantly. Add to that a perfectionism so intense, it often left him in emotional paralysis, and you start to see the man behind the myth. Then came the crash. In 1956, after leaving a party at Elizabeth Taylor's house, Montgomery drove off the road and smashed into a telephone pole. His jaw shattered. His face, once the definition of leading man perfection, was never the same. The studios tried to hide it with clever lighting and camera angles. But Clift felt the change. He became more withdrawn, more haunted. He turned to pills to manage the pain, physical and emotional, and leaned on alcohol to get through the nights. The man once called the future of film now looked like a ghost of himself. Yet somehow, in roles like the Misfits and Judgment at Nuremberg, he delivered performances so raw they seemed ripped from his soul. Montgomery Clift's darkest secret? He never stopped suffering. Not from a crash, but from a life lived as a beautiful lie. And Hollywood, as always, only loved him until he broke. Tallulah Bankhead was the kind of woman who didn't just enter a room, she took it over. Loud, sharp, magnetic, and completely out of control. Her voice rasped like broken glass wrapped in silk. She didn't whisper scandal. She lived it, unapologetically, flamboyantly, and destructively. She came from Southern aristocracy, but burned every rule she was born under. In the golden age of censorship and studio-mandated perfection, Tallulah was saying things on live radio that would make executives panic. She was openly bisexual in an era that didn't have the language for it, and she didn't care who knew. She drank like a sailor, smoked constantly, and popped pills like breath mints. She once arrived at a rehearsal, lit cigarette in hand, announced she hadn't slept in 2 days, and demanded the show go on. This wasn't a one-off. This was her normal. But behind the outrageous quotes and devil-may-care image was a woman slowly unraveling. Her addictions weren't whispered about, they were on display. And yet no one intervened. Maybe they thought it was just Tallulah being Tallulah. But the wildness was covering something deeper. Loneliness, exhaustion, and a career that began to fracture as quickly as her health. By the 1960s, she was a shadow of her former self, still dramatic, still wild, but barely able to perform. Her voice, once commanding, had eroded to a whisper. And those who remember her as a firebrand watched her fade into something unrecognizable. Tallulah Bankhead's dark secret wasn't that she broke the rules. It's that she broke herself in the process. And Hollywood stood by, applauding the show, until the curtain finally fell. Peter Lorre had the kind of face you didn't forget. Hollow eyes, nervous twitch, a voice that crept under your skin. He made his name playing killers, creeps, and haunted men. But the real darkness wasn't in the roles, it was in the man himself. Lorre fled Nazi Germany in the 1930s, escaping with his life and little else. He found fame in Hollywood through M, The Maltese Falcon, and Casablanca, but he never shook the outsider label. Studios loved his eerie presence, but never trusted him with the spotlight. He was always the supporting act, always the villain, never the man audiences were meant to love. Behind the scenes, Lorre struggled with chronic pain and insomnia, for which he was prescribed powerful medications. The relief gave way to reliance, and soon he was fighting a different kind of battle, one that few even knew about. As his fame faded, the grip of those pills tightened. He began to drift, both professionally and personally. In his later years, he was almost unrecognizable, bloated, tired, no longer the sharp, haunted figure audiences remembered. His roles dried up. He was a trivia fact to younger actors, a wasn't he in that one movie memory, slowly dissolving in the rear view of Hollywood history. There's something especially cruel about his end. A man who gave life to some of cinema's most unforgettable characters, slowly forgotten himself. His performances were chilling because they came from somewhere real, somewhere he couldn't escape. Peter Lorre's darkest secret? He wasn't playing monsters. He was living with one. And in the end, it consumed him quietly, completely, and without applause. Marilyn Monroe was the dream, the fantasy, the perfect woman in a white dress, standing over a subway, great with the whole world watching. But beneath the beauty, the diamonds, and the breathy voice was a woman slowly disappearing into an image she never chose, and could never escape. Born Norma Jean, she was passed from foster home to foster home, shaped by instability long before the cameras ever found her. When Hollywood did take notice, it didn't see her, just her body, her innocence, her potential to sell dreams. They changed her name, her hair, her voice. They sculpted Marilyn Monroe like a product. And it worked. But the real woman never disappeared. She was just trapped. Marilyn struggled to be taken seriously. She wanted dramatic roles, deeper scripts, and creative control. Instead, she was handed fluff, expected to giggle and sway, and be grateful for it. Studios exploited her image. Men obsessed over her. The press picked her apart. And behind the spotlight, she fought a growing sense of emptiness. To cope with the pressure, the loneliness, the insomnia, she was given pills. prescribed by doctors, managed by handlers. A routine of silence, sleep, wake, perform, repeat. Her marriages fell apart. Her health began to fray. Her smile remained, but her eyes often told a different story. Tired, distant, somewhere else entirely. There's a famous photo of her wrapped in a blanket on set, surrounded by people, yet looking completely alone. That was the real Marilyn, not the icon, but the woman who wanted to be loved for who she was, not what she represented. Marilyn Monroe's darkest secret wasn't scandal, it was sorrow. A life spent trying to escape a fantasy that never let her go. Robert Mitchum was the original Hollywood outlaw. He didn't just play the tough guy, he was the tough guy. With his heavy-lidded stare and gravel voice, he looked like he'd seen things no one talks about. And in many ways, he had. Mitchum never wanted to play by Hollywood's rules. He laughed in the face of image consultants, mocked interviewers, and treated stardom like a game he couldn't be bothered to take seriously. But beneath the swagger was something harder to define, a defiance that often felt like it came from pain. In 1948, Mitchum was arrested during a marijuana raid at a private party in Los Angeles. At the time, it was a career-ending scandal. But not for him. Mitchum shrugged it off like a hangover, served his time, and walked back onto a movie set with the kind of swagger most actors had to fake. He made being damaged look cool. But that too was an act. Behind closed doors, Mitchum drank heavily, routinely, quietly, and without apology. Friends said he carried a sadness he rarely spoke about. His temper was unpredictable. He could be warm one day, cold the next. He didn't self-destruct in public like some stars. He just slowly eroded, bottle by bottle, behind a mask of indifference. One of the most chilling things about Mitchum's darkness is how controlled it was. He never spiraled. He coasted, emotionally checked out, dragging his ghosts along for the ride. Robert Mitchum's secret? He made pain look effortless. But sometimes the scariest demons aren't the loud ones. They're the ones that get comfortable, settle in, and never leave. Jean Harlow was Hollywood's first platinum blonde, the template for every siren that came after her. Her image was electric, seductive, playful, untouchable. But behind the shimmering smile and bleach blonde hair was a young woman held tightly in the grip of a studio system that owned everything, including her silence. She rose to fame fast. By age 21, she was a box office sensation, lighting up screens in Red Dust and Dinner at 8. But she was never allowed to be young or human. MGM molded her image with surgical precision. She was their starlet, their asset. Her weight, her voice, her hair, her relationships, every part of her life was micromanaged. Then came the tragedies. Her second husband, producer Paul Byrne, died mysteriously just 2 months after they were married. The official story was self-harm, but rumors swirled about abuse, about studio interference, about things that would never be printed in the press. MGM moved quickly to protect the brand. Jean was back on set days later, smiling for cameras while reporters circled like vultures. But her health was quietly falling apart. She complained of pain, fatigue, and swelling. Doctors misdiagnosed her repeatedly. Some say she was self-medicating to get through the shoots. Others believe the studios ignored her symptoms to keep the cameras rolling. On the set of Saratoga, she collapsed. Less than 2 weeks later, she was gone. She was just 26. Jean Harlow's dark secret wasn't scandal, it was neglect. The way an entire system ignored a dying woman because her name still drew ticket sales. Her story isn't loud. It's quiet. And that's what makes it so disturbing. Spencer Tracy was Hollywood royalty. 2-time Oscar winner. The actor-directors trusted. The man audiences believed because everything he did on screen felt real. But that realism came from somewhere very personal. Deep beneath his polished performances was a man in constant conflict with himself. Tracy lived a double life. A devout Catholic, he refused to divorce his wife, even though they lived separately for decades. At the same time, he carried on a long, intense relationship with Katharine Hepburn, a love that couldn't be public, couldn't be celebrated, and by all accounts, couldn't give him peace. The guilt tore at him. His faith wouldn't allow him to fully claim the life he wanted. And so, he stayed in the in-between, never free, always haunted. To cope, he drank. Quietly, relentlessly. He was what they called a functioning alcoholic, always professional when the cameras rolled, but unreliable, even volatile, behind the scenes. Studios covered for him. Directors adjusted shooting schedules around his hangovers. His talent bought him time, forgiveness, and silence. Those closest to him described moments of sudden fury, long silences, and deep sadness. Hepburn once said she could never reach the part of him that was always hurting. It wasn't just the alcohol, it was something older, deeper, always there. In his final film, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, you can see it. The tremble in his voice, the weight in his eyes. He was giving everything he had left. 17 days later, he was gone. Spencer Tracy's dark secret was never explosive, it was internal. A slow erosion of self, masked by decades of brilliance. His pain never made headlines, but it was there. Always. They were legends. Icons. Faces that lit up the golden age of cinema. But behind every red carpet smile and polished studio photo was a human being, hurting, hiding, and unraveling beneath the surface. These weren't just personal struggles. They were the byproducts of a system built on image, silence, and control. A machine that demanded perfection but offered no space for pain. These stars gave us their best on screen and carried the worst off it alone. Some faded quietly. Others burned out in front of the world. But all of them remind us that behind every spotlight is a shadow, long, complex, and often unseen. If you've made it this far, thank you. Not just for watching, but for remembering these stories with empathy, not judgment. The glamour was real, but so was the darkness. And sometimes, it's the part we never see that tells us the most.